Hi guys, in today's reading section video, we're going to be going over how to understand and how to improve your performance on the history passage of the SAT reading section. So to give you a brief overview of what we'll be talking about today, I'll start off with the general discussion of what to expect from the history passage, and then I'll be giving you some general techniques and pointers on how to improve your own performance and how to improve your own comprehension of what's being written in these passages. And as always, we'll end with an analysis of a history passage from a released SAT. And of course, with the notes, you'll find the practice problems that go along with this passage so that you can practice and apply these techniques in your own time. So first off, what to expect. So the history passage has always been sort of notorious for being this extremely hard to understand, hard to answer, hard to comprehend passage on the SAT, for the reason that it's written in this style of English that's very different to what we are used to seeing. As opposed to, some literature passages, the science passages, which are written in sort of a more straightforward manner, the history passage is written in like an old English style. So it can be really hard for students who aren't familiar with this style to comprehend the passage and answer questions about it. Reading the history passage is sort of like reading a foreign language, because you sort of have to translate what the author is saying into your own words, and then you have to understand what the author is saying, and then only then can you answer the questions. But hopefully, with some techniques that I'll be talking about today, you can learn to, sort of decode this style of writing, and hopefully you can, improve your performance overall on this section. So the first tip I would like to give is to identify the author's thesis or the author's central claim in their passage as soon as possible, as early in the passage as possible when you're reading. We all know the feeling of, getting through a whole passage or a whole paragraph and thinking to yourself, what did I just read there? And having to, reread, go back and read all the way from the beginning. This is just, a waste of time. The best way I can think about to combat this is to force yourself to find, a main idea of the passage as early as possible so you don't get lost as you progress later on into the passage. This works as a strategy because you're sort of forcing yourself to find a point of focus in the passage. It's sort of like an anchor. By anchoring yourself down to this sort of main idea, then it's easier to navigate the rest of the passage without getting lost in the language or getting, lost in the hard parts of the passage. The second tip I would like to give is to translate as you read the passage. We know that the history passage is put into sort of old English style, and we know that it's hard to understand. Some sentences you may not even know what the author is trying to say. But a good way to sort of work through these sentences, a good way of sort of working through these hard parts of the passage, is by translating it into words that make sense in your own mind. And this sort of goes hand in hand with identifying the thesis early, because if you understand what the main point the author is trying to say, it's easier to understand sort of these smaller sentences, because you know that these smaller sentences are likely related to the main idea, so it's easier for you to translate in that way. And the last tip, I think that's very important with any SAT reading passage, and especially the history passage in general, is that you have to be okay with not knowing what a certain sentence means. If you don't understand a word, a phrase, a paragraph, a sentence, you shouldn't get caught up rather in trying to figure out what that means. A lot of the times, test takers will sort of get so tunnel visioned into figuring out what a single sentence means that they'll sort of waste a lot of time trying to look at one single sentence instead of just moving on and answering the questions. So we don't want to be wasting time like this. If you don't understand a single sentence, but you understand, the main idea of the passage and the main idea of the paragraph, then it's okay to move on, and it's okay to, sort of skip that sentence and continue your analysis of the passage. So with that said, we'll be moving on to the passage analysis. So this first passage. Passage 1 is adapted from Edmund Burke, Reflections on the Revolution in France, originally published in 1790. Passage 2 is adapted from Thomas Paine, Rights of Man, originally published in 1791. So they are very closely related in the sense of time, at least. Passage 1, to avoid the evils of inconstancy and versatility, 10,000 times worse than those of obstinacy and the blindest prejudice, we have consecrated the state, that no man should approach to look into its defects or corruptions, but with due caution, that he should never dream of beginning its reformation by its subversion, that he should approach to the faults of the state as to the wounds of a father. So let's sort of understand what the author is saying here. So Burke is basically saying, to avoid these sort of evils of inconsistency, of inconstancy, of versatility, of change, we have to not, nitpick at the defects or corruptions of the state. But if we are to do this, we have to do it with extreme caution. We should never try to, reform the government. We should never try to propose change by subversion or by destruction. We should never try to, make a revolution that's violent, because this is extremely dangerous, or at least in the views of the author. Instead, we should, sort of approach the faults, the things we want fixed, as to the wounds of a father, with a pious awe and a trembling solicitude. By this wise prejudice, we are taught to look with horror on those children of their country who are prompt rashly to hack that aged parent in pieces. So the author is sort of convincing the reader to, look down on, to sort of take offense against those who sort of are inspiring change by destroying everything in their sight, and put him into the kettle of magicians in hopes that by their poisonous weeds and wild incantations they may regenerate the paternal constitution and renovate their father's life. Society is indeed a contract. Subordinate contracts for objects of mere occasional interest may be dissolved at pleasure. But the state ought not to be considered as nothing better than a partnership agreement in a trade of pepper and coffee, calico or tobacco, or some other such low concern, to be taken up for a little temporary interest and to be dissolved by the fancy of the parties. So in this first sentence of the second paragraph, the author is basically saying that society is not sort of this, temporary agreement, this sort of, inconsequential agreement between two parties, as in trade. Trade, as in the trade of pepper and coffee, calico and tobacco, is sort of just this thing that isn't really extremely important. It's sort of just this small event, a small contacting between two people, a small contract of trade. But society is not like that. Society is not something that can be sort of dissolved at ease. It's sort of this thing that stands through time. It should stand through time, and it should, stay in place. It shouldn't just be dissolved and sort of cast away and reformed willy-nilly. It is a partnership in all science, a partnership in all art, a partnership in every virtue and in all perfection. As the ends of such a partnership cannot be obtained in many generations, it becomes a partnership not only in between those who are living, but between those who are living, those who are dead, and those who are to be born. So this sort of is the thesis statement of the first author, Edmund Burke. He is sort of saying that we shouldn't be so quick to dissolve society, to change society, because this brings inconstancy and versatility. His belief is that society is, this strong contract, a contract that transcends time, a contract that is not only between those who are living, but between those who are living, their fathers before them, and their fathers before them as well. So moving on, the municipal corporations of that universal kingdom are not morally at liberty, at their pleasure, and on the speculations of a contingent improvement, wholly to separate and tear asunder the bands of their subordinate community. So people are not at liberty to, tear down their community, to tear down everything, and to dissolve it into, this sort of violence, unsocial, uncivil, unconnected chaos. So sort of as a summary of passage 1, the author really sees society as it is, government as it is, as a sort of contract that transcends time, a contract that shouldn't be changed very quickly. Okay, so now that we know that, let's move on to passage 2. I don't know why this is highlighted, but whatever. Every age and generation must be as free to act for itself in all cases as the ages and generations which preceded it. So immediately we kind of see a contrast between passage 2 and passage 1, because passage 1, it sort of talked about how society and government transcends time. It's not only a contract between those who are living, but also between those who are living and those who are dead. But passage 2, immediately at the beginning, they say that every age and generation are free to act for themselves. Just because a previous generation had it this way doesn't mean the current generation must have it that way as well. They can decide what's best for themselves. The vanity and presumption of governing beyond the grave, so again, governing from the past, is the most ridiculous and insolent of all tyrannies. So we already see, first paragraph of the passage, passage 2, Thomas Paine is taking a very, very different belief than the first author, Edmund Burke. Man has no property in man, neither has any generation a property in the generations which are to follow. The Parliament or the people of 1688 or of any other period had no more right to dispose of the people of the present day, or to bind or to control them in any shape whatever, than the Parliament or the people of the present day have to dispose of, bind, or control those who are to live 100 or 1,000 years hence. So he's saying here that just as our current government can't control the government of people 1,000, 100 years in the future, our current government can't be controlled by the government of the past. Every generation is and must be competent to all the purposes which its occasions require. It is the living and not the dead that are to be accommodated. When man ceases to be, his power and his wants cease with him, and having no longer any participation in the concerns of this world, he has no longer any authority in directing who shall be its governors or how its government shall be organized or administered. So basically sort of repeating what he said earlier. When a man dies, when someone dies, his power, his rule, his government, his beliefs die with him. There's no reason to honor the beliefs of the dead, to honor the past in the present when the situations are so different. Those who have quitted the world and those who are not yet arrived at it are as remote from each other as the utmost stretch of mortal imagination can conceive. People of the future and people of the past are so far apart, is what he's saying here. What possible obligation then can exist between them? What rule or principle can be laid down that two non-entities, the one out of existence and the other not in, and who never can meet in this world, that the one should control the other to the end of time? Again, sort of repeating the main thesis that he has. If, one generation is already out of existence and one is in existence, these two groups can never meet. So who is to say that the group that's already dead can control the group that is still existing in the world? The circumstances of the world are continually changing, and the opinions of men change also. And as government is for the living and not for the dead, it is the living only that has any right in it. That which may be thought right and found convenient in one age may be thought wrong and found inconvenient in another. In such cases, who is to decide, the living or the dead? So again, repeating the main thesis that he has. Here, Payne is arguing sort of that times change. 100 years from now, the rules might be completely different from the rules we have today. So logically, what logically follows from this is that the people in the present time should be able to decide. People in the present time shouldn't be bound by what their ancestors, what their forefathers thought was right in their time, because the present times are very much different from the times of the past. So I hope this analysis of this passage helped, and I really encourage you guys to go over the practice questions that I've included in the notes. And of course, if you have any questions, leave comments in Google Classroom, leave comments in the Messenger group, or email us. All right, thanks.